Welcome to this Spring tutorial from in 28 minutes. Before we look into the specific topic at hand, let's get an overview of what we are trying to do at in 28 minutes to make learning Spring easy. We have a repository on Git, github.com/in28 minutes Spring in 28 minutes. The link you would find below the video, where we have all the code examples that we are going to discuss now. All those are present in the Git repository. So if you go to Spring in 28 minutes, there are a lot of example Maven projects which would help you learn Spring very easily. We start with simple examples and discuss things like JDBC, aspect-oriented programming, MVC, and all that kind of stuff. You should find examples in here. If you go further down, you should also see how you can install these examples which are used in this particular tutorial. So you can click this link, takes you to a video which shows how you can install all the code that you would need to be able to run all the examples that we discussed. Let's now get started with the specific topic of this particular video. The next topic we are going to discuss is aspect-oriented programming. How do we implement aspect-oriented programming with Spring Framework? Before that, we would want to understand what is aspect-oriented programming and what are the kinds of scenarios where I can use aspect-oriented programming. Let's start with that. What you're seeing on your screen right now is kind of a typical web application flow. So I have a web layer calls the business layer calls the data layer. What I want to do is every time a particular business method is called, I would want to log that particular statement. For example, let's say every time the to-do business service IMPL is called, I would want to log what is the method call, what are the input parameters that are there, and what would be the return value that is written back from there. I would want to log all this information along with how much time it took to execute that particular method. If I want to do this kind of things, if there was nothing like aspect-oriented programming, the way I would need to do that is I have to implement the logic in every method. So every time we call a method in the business service, in that particular method, we would need to do all the logic. Let's see an example. So let's say this is one of the methods which is present in the business layer. What I would need to do is if I want to log every method call, then I have to put a logger dot or a sysout. For now, I would do a sysout, but actually in a real-time application, it should be a logger. So I'm here doing a sysout that this particular method is called. So what's the method name? This method is called with parameter user. And after the method completes execution, I would want to return back what is the value that is returned. So I would need to say, I'll also refactor this a little bit. I'll extract a local variable, filtered to-dos. And now I can print the value of filtered to-dos, which is the return value from this method out retrieve to-dos completed execution and returned. What did it return back? It returned the filtered to-dos back. So now this is one of the methods in the business layer, right? But let's say I want to do this for every method in the business layer. So I have to do this kind of logic everywhere inside the business layer. So I have to keep doing this in every method in the business layer so that I know whether a particular method is executed or not. That's the problem. The basically thing is this logic of logging everything is repeated everywhere. So the fact that I want to log something in every method is a common functionality. But the fact that I have to repeat the common functionality across all the business objects is the problem. And that's where aspect-oriented programming comes into picture. In aspect-oriented programming, I can say, I want to do this on every method call in the business layer. So you can kind of define a regular expression to identify what are the different things that you would want to intercept. So I can say on every method call inside the business layer, at the start of the method call, I want to log what are the parameters. At the end of the method call, I want to log what is the return value.
That's what aspect-oriented programming enables us to do. There is a lot of terminology which is associated with aspect-oriented programming. Before we get in there, let's look at what are the different options of implementing aspect-oriented programming when you're using Spring. In general, there are two different options. One is there is little bit of basic functionality, aspect-oriented programming functionality, which is provided by the Spring AOP framework itself. So the Spring framework itself has a little bit of functionality to implement aspect-oriented programming. However, if you need complex aspect-oriented programming functionality, what do I mean by complex aspect-oriented functionality? For example, you'd want to intercept a method call which is on something which is not managed by Spring. If something is not managed by Spring, then obviously Spring cannot intercept it. So in that kind of situations, you can go for a aspect-oriented framework like AspectJ. And also, Spring can only intercept simple things like a method call. So if you want to intercept more complex things than that, then probably you should go for aspect-oriented programming. For example, when a value of a field is changed, that's something which AspectJ can intercept and find out, but not a Spring framework. Like the the basic functionality, the basic aspect-oriented functionality which Spring provides would be good enough to intercept method call. So before the method call, do this. After the method call, do this. After returning the value, do this. If there's an exception, do this. Those kind of things would be possible in Spring framework, but not field level things. If you want field level things, then you would need to go and use a proper aspect-oriented programming framework like AspectJ. In this particular example that we would be looking at, we would be using AspectJ and we would be intercepting a few method calls. So what are the things that you would need to be able to use AspectJ? As we discussed earlier, all the code for these examples is present in Git. So this particular thing is present in the folder github.com/in28minutes/spring in 28 minutes. If you look at the dependencies of this particular project, you'd see Spring AOP, Spring Aspects, and AspectJ Weaver. These are the different jars that you would need to have in your dependencies if you would want to make use of aspect-oriented programming. So now that we understood what is needed to be able to run aspect-oriented programming, let's get into the details and see what are the different things that different terminologies that aspect-oriented programming uses in general. The important terminologies that aspect-oriented programming uses are aspect, point cut, join point, advice, and weaving. Let's start with the first thing, aspect. What do we want to do? We want to log every method call to a business layer. That is basically what is an aspect. Aspect is kind of the functionality that you would want to implement. For example, if I want to implement transaction management using aspect-oriented programming, then as transaction management is the aspect which we are trying to implement in here. So typical aspects might be things like transaction management, logging, performance metrics. Probably you want to find out how much time a method took to execute. Then performance metrics is the aspect. So aspect is exactly what you want to achieve through aspect-oriented programming. In the specific example that we would be looking at, the aspect is logging. So what we want to do is at every method call in the business layer, I would want to intercept it and I would want to log the input parameters and what is the output. So in our specific case, the aspect we are looking at is logging. The next important thing is something called a point cut. What is a point cut? A point cut is, you can think of it as a regular expression, some kind of an expression which determines what calls are to be intercepted. The thing which is highlighted in the screen right now is an example of a point cut. What we are trying to say is on hi by service, any method call. So any method call on hi by service, we want to intercept. So that's basically what is a point cut. So point cut defines what are the things you would want to intercept. This expression, so this expression, the entire expression, which defines what are the method calls that needs to be intercepted. Those are the thing, that's the expression which is called a point cut. So this would intercept any method call. Let's say I have a method hi by service dot execute or do something. All these method calls would be intercepted by putting a star in here. This would intercept every method call on the hi by service, and this is what is called a point cut. So a point cut is basically a kind of an expression which defines what are the method calls that I would want to intercept. When do you want aspect oriented programming to be applied? That is the thing which is defined by a point cut. So two things which we have discussed until now. One is aspect. Aspect is basically the functionality which I want to implement. That's logging. The point cut is actually the expression which decides when the aspect is applied. So when is logging done? On every method call in hi by service. And that's defined by the point cut. So what is advice? Advice is basically what is to be done when the point cut is met. For example, in here what we are doing is we are saying if this point cut is met, then print this out. So this is the functionality. So I'm saying if this point cut is met, then do a sysout before and also print name of that particular method. So join point.getSignature.getName gets the name of the method that is being called. This code that you want to execute when a particular point cut expression is met is called an advice. Advice is basically what do you want to happen? That's basically the advice. In this particular method, this is the advice. I would want to print the return value. That's basically the advice. So until now, we have looked at three different things. The reason why we keep repeating this is because if you are a first time programmer and this is the first time you are looking at aspect oriented programming, getting used to the terminology is one of the biggest challenges. And that's why we repeat it multiple times so that it registers in your mind. So basically aspect is the functionality that I'm going to implement. That's logging. I want to implement logging. That's aspect. Point cut is the expression which defines which kind of methods are to be intercepted. So here I'm saying every method call on hi by service needs to be intercepted. That's what is defined by point cut. Advice is exact piece of code. What happens when this particular point cut is met? So when this is met, I want to log. So sys out the parameters to the method. So that's what is the advice that we are doing in here. The last two things that we would look at are join point and weaving. The things which we looked until now are kind of compile time terminologies. At compile time, you can define, what is the aspect, what is the point cut, and what is the advice. So that's static at compile time. The next things that we would be looking at are more dynamic stuff. I mean, this is runtime stuff. At a particular point in execution, so I've defined an aspect and a point cut and an advice. So I've defined something in here. Join point is more a runtime thing. So when I'm executing and this particular thing matches, the join point comes into picture. Join point is basically execution of the specific AOP method that we have defined. So at runtime, once every condition is met, this method is executed. And this execution of this method is called a join point. And the last terminology is weaving. When this particular condition is met, it would make sure that this method is executed. That process of getting the whole thing wired together is called weaving. So whenever this method is, whenever this point cut is met, this method needs to be executed. The entire process around that is called weaving. Okay, so those are the important terminologies from the perspective of aspect-oriented programming. Let's get started with our first example. What we are looking at in here is a simple hi by service. So a hi by service, what does it do? It says hi, it says bye, and at the end we are returning something back as well. So there are three methods in here. So what I would want to do is before every method call, I would want to print something, and after the method is completed execution, I would want to print something out as well. So I would want to do that on all these three methods. So before I call say hi, I would want to say this method is executed. And after say hi is done, then I would want to print this method has completed execution. Similarly with say bye, and return something. So let's look at the first example. I have a simple test where I'm calling the say hi service. So the service.sayHi is being called and everything is auto-wired by Spring. So what we want to do is whenever the say hi is called, I would want to print something to the output. We want to auto-wire that in. So how do we do that? That's basically what we are going to look at right now. So the first thing is I'm creating a class called aspect. So this class aspect is the critical thing. So I have to put a annotation at aspect on it. So I'm using an aspect J annotation at aspect, and it also has to be something which is managed by Spring. So I'm putting an add component as well. The first thing I'm doing in here, if you look at it, is add before annotation. Add before annotation is used to identify something I want to do before the execution of a particular method. So if I want to do something before the execution of a method, I use the add before annotation. And next, I'm defining the point cut. So I'm defining the point cut to say this is the entire package where this particular thing is there, and this is the hi bye service. So I would want to intercept every method call on the particular thing. So I would want to intercept every method call on hi bye service. Point cut defines, and this is the method which we would define what we want to do when the point cut is met. The join point basically contains all the information about the method call, all the runtime information about the method call. So at runtime, what is the method that is being called? So that you can get by saying join point dot get signature dot get name. And now I can go ahead and run this particular program, and you would see that since if you look at it in here, we are calling two methods, say hi and say bye. Let's see if both of them get printed. So right click, run as JUnit test. There you go. You see hi is printed and bye is printed. Hi is from the say hi method, but before hi, you'd see that before say hi method is printed, and also before say bye method is also printed. So before these methods are invoked, this particular code which is in here is getting executed. And that's the beauty of aspect-oriented programming. So I can define at a common place what needs to be done at the start and end of a method. And things like transaction management, which define on this kind of a thing, is very, very easy to implement. So similar to the add before annotation, there is something called add after annotation. I want to do add after the execution of the method. So I would call this after. I mean, the name of the method does not really matter, because what really matters is the annotation on the method. And this is after the execution of the method. So I'll say after. Now you would see that when I run this particular program, you would see that after is printed after every method call. Now you see hi method is called, and before calling the hi method, before say hi, and after calling the say hi, after say hi, and same thing for say bye as well. So before each method call and after every method call, there is a specific thing which is happening. Let's say this particular method had a couple of arguments being passed. So I would want to print what arguments are being passed. How do I do that? System.out.println. I want to print the arguments. The way you can do that is by saying join point dot get args. And this would print what are the arguments which are passed to that particular thing. And this would return an array. So to print this, I would use arrays.toString of this particular thing. In here, as of now, we are not passing in any arguments as such. So what I would do is I would add an argument. So to this say hi method, I would add an argument saying string name. And here I would append the name in. So now when I call the say hi method, I'll pass the name. So I'll say in 28 minutes as the name. Oops. Okay. Now let's see if the in 28 minutes argument, which is the argument which is passed to this particular method, to the method say hi, is printed properly. So let's have this as print so that it prints in the same line. Before this, and this is called with arguments which are specified in the next line. So let's go ahead and execute this. So now you'd see that before say hi called with in 28 minutes. So in 28 minutes is the argument which is passed to say hi, and hi in 28 minutes is printed, and after say hi. And the next thing is before say hi called with, we didn't pass any arguments to say bye. So before say bye is called with nothing, no arguments, and bye is printed, and after say bye. So now we are able to intercept a method call, we are able to print the arguments, and we are also intercepting the completion of a method call, and we are also able to print the completion of that particular method. That's really great. Now, I would also want to be able to print the return value from a method. So let's say I want to print the return value from the method. So this return something, I would want to call this, and I would want to print the return value which is coming in here in the AOP. I mean, in the AOP itself. So now I would do service dot return something, and I would want to intercept the return call. If I want to intercept the return call, then there is an annotation after returning. When I want to get the return value, it's a little bit more complex. So I have added in the annotation after returning, and I have to define a couple of annotations in here. By default, if I don't put anything in here, then it would be taken as point cut. But when I want to add another argument, I'll say point cut is equal to this particular expression, and I have to pass in another argument which says returning. So what is returning is the result. So join point, and we also want to get the result of the execution. So I would say object result. So what would happen is the result is put into this particular thing, and after the execution of this, what did we get? Result is plus result. Let's see now what would happen. You'd see that first say hi is called, and after say hi result is null because say hi does not return anything back. Same with say bye, it does not return anything back. But return something method, it's called with no arguments, but it is returning back hi bye. So after return something, result is hi bye. So basically we are able to intercept the return value of this, and we were able to print it in here. So now we have looked at how to intercept very basic things with aspect-oriented programming. We intercepted method calls, we printed what are the arguments passed to a method, we printed what are the return values from the method, and we did something at the end of execution of a particular method. And these are quite the most common things that are done using aspect-oriented programming. And whatever we have seen forms the basic for implementing even complex functionalities like transaction management and performance logging. They're absolutely based on this basic stuff.
Hope you had a good time learning Spring in this particular tutorial. You will find more examples about dependency injection, inversion of control, Spring modules, JDBC, aspect-oriented programming, MVC, and a lot of that kind of examples on our Git repository, as well as links to a number of video tutorials. You'd find a list of more than 10 videos which you can look at to understand Spring even more on the GitHub repository. What's stopping you? Just go down there, look at all the examples, and become an expert on Spring. And by the way, do not forget to subscribe. Until next time, bye-bye.